Okay, I think we've given folks a couple of minutes, so I think we are good to go. So hello, everyone, good morning. My name is Neil Cowan, and I'm Policy and Campaigns Manager at the Poverty Alliance. So firstly, thank you for joining us this Friday morning for this webinar, which is the second in a series of 3 webinars that we're running over the summer as part of our Get Heard Scotland programme. For those of you who don't know, so Get Heard Scotland is an initiative that we've been running at the Poverty Alliance for 3 years now, going into our 4th year, and which is funded by the Scottish Government as part of the Tackling Child Poverty delivery plan. And the premise of Get Heard Scotland is very simply to ensure that people living on low incomes in Scotland, as well as the organisations, particularly community-based organisations that work with people on low incomes, can have a real and a meaningful say about the design and delivery of anti-poverty policy in Scotland, both at the local and the national level. So the 3 webinars that we're holding form a part of this work with Get Heard Scotland, alongside interviews and focus groups and community discussions with people living on low incomes. And these discussions and all of this engagement will help, we hope, provoke discussion about the content of and to inform the next Child Poverty Delivery Plan, which is being published next year. And this plan will set out the Scottish Government's priorities for tackling child poverty up until 2026. So these webinars are intended to provide an opportunity to debate and discuss some of the key issues, identify in particular what we should be prioritising in the plan and in the coming years. So this morning's webinar will focus on the action we need, particularly action on incomes, to ensure that we meet the child poverty targets set by the 2017 Child Poverty Scotland Act. And I'm really delighted that we're joined by 3 brilliant speakers. So we have Emma Congreve, who is Knowledge Exchange Fellow at the Fraser Allander Institute, John Dickie, who is Director of Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland, and Rachel Statham, who is Senior Research Fellow at IPPR Scotland. So Emma, John and Rachel will each speak for around 15 or so minutes each on the action that they believe we need on incomes in order to reach the child poverty targets that have been set. After that, there'll be time for questions and for discussion. And I really encourage you all to submit questions as we go along via the chat function. And I should also say this meeting is set up on Zoom as a meeting rather than a webinar, so you can keep your camera off or on depending on how you feel or how much coffee you've had this morning. But please do keep your mic off unless you're speaking or asking a question. And I should also say that we're recording this meeting to share with folk who couldn't make it this morning. So that's probably enough spiel from me. So I'll pass over to our first speaker, who is Emma. So once again, Emma is Knowledge Exchange Fellow at the Fraser Allander Institute, which is based at the University of Strathclyde, and which is one of Scotland's leading economic research institutes focused on the Scottish economy. So Emma, over to you.
Thanks, Neil. Good morning, everybody. So as Neil said, I'm an economist at the Fraser Allander Institute. And so we're a public policy institute looking at a range of issues around public policy, the economy, and household incomes is a big part of my work. So today I'm going to talk about some of the analysis that we are starting to pull together now ahead of next year's Child Poverty Delivery Plan. And our role at the Institute is very much about trying to inform the debate and sort of shine a light on some of the key issues. And we've been funded by the Standard Life Foundation for some of this work, which we're doing in collaboration with Manchester Metropolitan University and the Poverty Alliance, to try and do the best we can to get some of the modelling insights and lived experience insights into the policy debate in good time. So I'm going to focus mostly on talking about income from employment today. So many of you will be familiar with this graphic, and myself, I was within the Scottish Government when the last delivery plan was being put together and remember this well. So these were the 3 key drivers that were put into the last Child Poverty Delivery Plan, focused on income poverty. And so these are the 3 ways in which the main ways poverty can be tackled. So I'm going to focus on income from employment, and I think Rachel and John will focus on some of those other aspects a little bit more. And the key thing I'm going to talk about, so this is just one breakdown of many that we're looking at, but looking at households where there is at least one parent who is out of work. And we're going to have a look at what we know about those family types. and therefore what potentially some of the solutions might be to alleviate poverty there. So this is all kind of preliminary analysis. I'm pretty sure it's all okay. It's all based on 3-year samples of HVI data, but normal caveats in terms of representativeness of Scottish data remain. But the first thing I've done here with one of my colleagues at the Fraser Allander, we've broken down child poverty, actually, and just in terms of this as well, number of children living in these 2 different family types. So single parent households and households where both parents are living within the household. So I guess the first thing that stands out is that there are many more children living in couple families than there are in single parent families. So that's the big red box. Put together, these total about 1 million children in total. But if you look at the dark grey box, so that's children living in poverty in these households, actually it's not too different between the two. There's slightly more children in couple families living in poverty than the single parents, but they're given the proportions, yeah, their numbers are quite similar. So the real standout from this is the poverty rate in each of these family types. So nearly 40% of children in single parent families are living in poverty compared to around 18% for couples. You know, that's a big disparity. And I think most of us would think that potentially earnings play a big role in this. I have to say that 18% for couples is still quite high and higher than it needs to be in order to meet the targets. So we will keep on looking at couples in this presentation. But single parents are, of course, a key priority group for the Scottish Government, and it's something which is really important when we're thinking about work and earnings. So in this next slide, what we have done is looked at where there is somebody in the household who's out of work. So in single parent families, that will mean that there's no adult in work. There's also the case in sort of dark grey bars here, where both of the parents in a couple household are out of work. Taken together, those red and dark grey blocks sort of represent what we think of as the, well, this is a term that no one likes, but the worklessness population in terms of when we're thinking about child poverty. But there's another really important group in this, and that's couples where there is one adult out of work. Normally the mother, we have to say, and there is a lot of children in that position. It's a big group of children, and actually if you look at the in poverty, the numbers in poverty, got about 80,000 children living in poverty where one parent is in work and one parent isn't. So there's quite an important nuance, because actually that light grey block of people would normally be considered as part of the in-work poverty group, and they are part of the in-work poverty group because one parent is working, but there's also one parent not working, so they share a lot of similarities potentially with single parent families, where we've got the focus on the primary caregiver trying to balance work and care. That same exists in couple families, and of course that income forgone from that one adult has serious financial implications. So that's just a little bit of kind of insight into these different groups. Not everyone can work, and work is not the entire answer. And actually, just a little digression, I've looked at the splitting out the populations where there, for these family types where you've got the adult out of work and in poverty. So it's that right hand side of that graph is the red blocks in this graph. And then I've looked at where there's a flag to say that there is somebody in that family that is disabled, either an adult or a child. So that's under the Equality Act definition. And it does represent a chunk out of all of these in terms of where there's a disability. And I guess you can think of that as a potential added constraint in terms of being able to work. I think the really interesting thing is when you look at couples where both are out of work, pretty much everyone is accounted for under this flag of disability. There's a bit of rounding going on here, so it's not, exact, but the basic kind of takeaway from this is there's very few households where both couples are out of work and there's not a disability. That seems to be the kind of driving force behind that. But that kind of disability constraint is apparent in these other household types as well. But there's more going on, and I think that's can be attributed to the issues around balancing work and care, particularly for mothers. So saying all this, of course, one of the routes to tackle poverty is to help more of those parents into work. But work is not the only answer. It can't go it alone. So earlier in the year, we did some modelling for the Poverty and Inequality Commission. And within that, we very bluntly tried to put every parent in poverty into full-time work, regardless of circumstance. We modelled it that way. And even in that situation, if every parent currently in poverty moved into work full-time at the minimum wage, we still were nowhere near meeting the poverty targets in 2030. So work is not the only answer. There has to be that combination of work, social security and housing. But just briefly, some of the things we're thinking about modelling, or trying to model in terms of solutions to people as a result of constraints of people working. So we're thinking about things like childcare, obviously, and a huge gap for under-twos in Scotland. And obviously anyone who's had to experience paying for childcare for young children knows it's crippling, and there's no public support really in place for under-twos, and there's only a limited amount for vulnerable twos in that category. Of course, there are other schemes going on, but in terms of public provision of childcare, there's a big gap. Support into employment, employability schemes, of course, are a big part of this, and the whole power that Scotland has. There's a lot going on in this in terms of rethinking and reform and no one left behind policies. I guess from work I've done and work that actually the JRF have put out recently, that need for employment support tailored for circumstances, it can't be overemphasized. Every parent with a child will have unique circumstances, and it isn't just a case of one size fits all. And of course, policy providers know this, but it can be quite hard, I think, to flex to get the right support in place. So you need things like support for childcare, support for transport, but slightly unusual hours to fit around school days, all of those type of things. And that's quite hard to get in place, but when it works, it will be transformational. A key thing which we know is from those tables in terms of the rate of people with disability, ill health, who are out of work and in poverty. So there has to be a big change in terms of the opportunities in place to get people into work who want to work and can work. Not all will be able to work, absolutely, but some can and want to. We know from work we've done at the Institute on adults with learning disabilities that there's a huge amount of people that desperately want to work, but just have got these barriers that mean that it's just not it's not been possible for them so far. And again, when the right support is in place, it can be transformational for their lives. So I think there's that real kind of push needed. We've got the targets on halving the disability employment gap, but for some segments of the disabled population, I think they're finding that the support is not yet there for them in order to actually translate those words into actions. I think the National Care Service could be quite influential in terms of the choices available for carers. Again, from the work we've done, adults with learning disabilities and their carers, the fights people have to go through to get any support can be quite, sometimes it's just not possible. Sometimes it's only possible after a lot of wrangling, and often it still doesn't leave enough time, in order to actually have paid work as an opportunity for people who have got significant caring responsibilities. Social security can play a role here, obviously, but again, there needs to be a choice for people in order to, you know, whether they take on unpaid care and are remunerated for that, or whether they can go into paid work and other support can be in place for those that they care for. The National Care Service could do something about that, and we'll have to wait and see. And then back to, you know, some of the more traditional things we think about. So obviously hours are a big issue for everyone. And I haven't talked about part-time work in this, but that obviously does play a role in terms of poverty when part-time work is what's available, and it may be insecure, and it may be difficult to kind of have that certainty around contracts. And pay, of course, it's more difficult for the Scottish government to kind of, you know, directly control pay. It's a reserve policy matter, minimum wage. There's lots of good stuff going on in terms of the living wage movement, but within all of this, there's huge structural issues here. The gender pay gap, you know, is basically a result of you know, that widening gap between pay. So much of it is down to mothers having to take time out of work when their children are young in order to provide that appropriate care. So yeah, fix the issues around parents being able to work when their children are young if they want to, and we'll make big strides in terms of closing the gender pay gap as well. So these are just some of the things we're looking at. We're still at relatively early stages of modelling out some of these options, and there's big challenges in terms of being able to model them. But if you do have any other kind of insights or ideas, feel free to get in touch. As I say, Poverty Alliance are involved in this project, so feel free to get in touch with Neil as well. This is my email and my Twitter handle. So we're doing a lot of engagement with people with lived experience. That's already started, and we'll continue to get their insights and ideas, but we're always willing to hear you know, inspiration from wherever it may come, and we can try and turn that into something that can be modelled and get a number at the end of it, which may be effective in some of the influencing with policymakers, or basically just help them have as much information as possible in order to build the best plan possible. So that is all I wanted to say, and yeah, happy to take questions. I think we'll do those at the end though.
Thanks very much, Emma. That was fantastic, and really, yeah, perfect way to kick us off. Just a reminder to everyone to submit questions as you go, if and when you have them, via the chat function. But now, yeah, handing over to John. So John is Director at Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland. And yeah, John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Neil, and thanks for involving me in today's discussion. And thanks to Emma for a really helpful presentation there. Lots to chew over there. Yeah, I'm Director of Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland. As the name suggests, our purpose as a charity is to work for an end to child poverty in Scotland and across the UK. We do that by raising awareness of child poverty, identifying evidence-based policy solutions to that poverty, and then working with others, including Poverty Alliance and many of you here today, to seek to influence policy in the interests of low-income families and in the interests of ending child poverty. I've been asked to speak a bit today about what we think is needed to achieve the child poverty targets, and in particular to focus on the interim child poverty target to reduce child poverty to less than 18% by 2023-24. Maybe worth just saying a few words about the context and the scale of poverty, child poverty that we face just now. Many of you this will be very familiar to, but the reality is the latest official figures showing that over 1 in 4 of our children officially recognised as living in poverty, 260,000 children. The poverty target for the interim poverty target means we need to reduce that to less than around 180,000 children, so less than 18% by 23-24. So that gives a sense of a scale of what's needed over the next few years. Maybe worth just highlighting that poverty line that we use to measure progress and is used for the targets is a poverty line that's an income that in most cases is less than 70% of the minimum income that the general public believe is needed for a basic but socially acceptable standard of living. So only 70% of the minimum income that's been used as the basis for the very welcome work to develop a minimum income guarantee here in Scotland. As Emma's highlighted, 2/3 of those children are living in families where an adult is working, but also worth maybe just reminding ourselves that some, and again Emma's touched on this, but some families at particular risk of poverty, some children at particular risk of poverty. So 1 in 3 children affected by disability growing up in poverty, 2 in 5 children in lone parent families, 2 in 5 in minority ethnic families, 1 in 3 children in larger families living in poverty at the moment. But perhaps what's even more important is it's worth reminding ourselves that behind these statistics are individual children and families, children who, despite the best efforts of their parents and their families, are seeing their education being undermined, with clear evidence that too often children in low-income families falling behind at every stage of their education, children whose health is being undermined, is being damaged. So children in low-income households 4 times more likely to have only fair or to have bad or very bad health than their better off peers, 4 times as likely to have poor mental well-being. And behind these statistics are tens of thousands of parents who are going without themselves, denying themselves the basics, food, but also just the basic treats in life that keep people sane in order to provide for their children. So meeting these targets matters. It matters not just because they're set in law, not just because they provide us with a measure towards the overall ambition of ending child poverty in Scotland, but because for every percentage point that we miss these targets by, we're leaving thousands of children in families without adequate resources, without an adequate income to give their children a decent start in life. We're condemning thousands of children to poorer health, poorer education, poorer life chances. And we're also racking up huge costs for all of us. The cost of picking up the pieces of child poverty, the lost contribution that those children would be making as they grow up and become contributing members, adults in our society. So yes, meeting these targets is challenging, but it is also absolutely vital. These were legal targets introduced by the last Scottish Government, set by the Parliament, passed by the Parliament, supported by all the political parties. They were set knowing the scale of the challenge. They were set knowing that UK policy was driving children into poverty rather than lifting children out of poverty. They were set without qualification or caveat. And the positive thing is they've already had a huge impact. They've driven real policy change, real improvements, not least the introduction of the Scottish child payment, that £10 per week per child payment for children and families in receipt of universal credit, already rolled out to under 6s. That really is, as we said at the time, a game changer. Even at the current level of £10 per week, it will substantially shift the trajectory on child poverty. And more directly, it's providing very real, vital, extra cash support to low-income families as we speak. But of course, shifting the trajectory isn't in itself enough, and current policy isn't itself enough. As Emma and Rachel and others have made absolutely clear, all the modelling suggests that on current policies, we'll be far off meeting the interim child poverty target, never mind the final 2030 target. But we mustn't be fatalistic. The interim targets are within reach. As Emma and Fraser of Allander have said, the good news is that meeting these targets is possible within the powers that the Scottish Government holds. So in that context, do we think is actually needed to achieve those targets? I think the first point is that we need to put child poverty at the heart of the Scottish budget process every year between now and 2030, if we're serious. We need to ensure that every spending decision is proofed for its contribution to reducing the numbers of children living in poverty. And particularly looking towards 2030, we need to look not just at spending decisions, but at tax decisions. How do we use our tax and spending powers to harness the income and the wealth that Scotland still has and does have in order to achieve what's been described and what's as a national mission to end child poverty. As part of that, we need to poverty-proof our economic recovery and business support policies for their impact on child poverty. Emma's touched on this. There's no point in supporting growth and jobs that continue to leave parents in jobs that are insecure, in jobs that fail to provide adequate income to protect them and their children from poverty. So we need to use the powers that government has, procurement powers, wage setting powers in the public sector, to drive improvements in the quality of work and the rewards from work in Scotland. Secondly, and most immediately, we need to see the very welcome commitment from the Scottish Government to doubling the Scottish Child Payment to £20 per week happen as a matter of utmost urgency. It's a hugely welcome commitment, a commitment that's supported by all the political parties, which creates a real unique opportunity, a moment to grasp. But doubling that payment, if we're serious about meeting the interim targets, needs to happen now. If that payment and that increase is to feed through and impact on the levels of child poverty by 23-24, it needs to happen immediately, be included in the coming programme for government and including it in the coming budget for investment next year, both to ensure that it makes a contribution to meeting those targets, but also to ensure that we provide that vital additional support to families now as we emerge from the pandemic and try and keep families afloat in particularly difficult circumstances. Thirdly, and I'll not dwell on this because Emma's covered it in far more detail than me, but we do need to ratchet up the focus on removing the barriers to work that parents face, tackling the labour market inequality that women face and that disabled people face. As Emma's analysis has shown, if we got rid of the gender and disability employment gaps, we'd be a long way towards achieving some of our child poverty targets. And in particular, we need to focus on tackling those childcare barriers, again, that Emma's touched on. So build on the delivery of the 1140 hours of funded childcare and move towards the 50 hours that the Social Renewal Advisory Board and many others have called on to remove that key barrier that parents, and particularly lone parents, face in terms of increasing their income from work. And finally, we need to continue to develop Scotland's social security system in a way that ensures all our families get the support that they're entitled to. We need to get the legislation right and the delivery right to ensure that rights are protected and that families receive the financial support that is being introduced and delivered here in Scotland, and deliver it in a way that continues to promote dignity and respect. And some really, we've come a long way in terms of developing Scottish social security in a way that delivers that, but we need to continue to be focused on that and relentless in the focus on take-up, so that we translate the modelling of the impact of increases in, for example, Scottish Child Payment into actual increases in people's pockets. I'll maybe begin to draw to a close there, but in summary, yes, we are currently off track in terms of achieving the interim target, and as a result, in terms of achieving the 2030 target. Yes, we need to recognise that government is facing a challenging economic, budget, financial situation, but important building blocks have been put in place. The introduction of the Scottish Child Payment, the investment in putting money into families' pockets has begun, and with political will and public support to match, the commitment to reach the interim targets can be met. In the short term, Social Security, and in particular the Scottish Child Payment here in Scotland, will need to do much of the heavy lifting if to reach 23-24. The wider action on improving labour market, improving access to employment, improving rewards to work, tackling housing costs are all absolutely critical and will be needed to achieve the 2030 target to reduce child poverty to less than 10%. But to reach the 23-24 targets, the reality is we need to use our social security levers to their maximum effect to put money into families' pockets and achieve those targets. That will build the foundations, maintain the momentum, maintain the faith that this is a project, this is a national mission that is achievable, maintain the faith, maintain the momentum. And that's why our number one call is to ensure that action is taken to double the payment now, giving ourselves time to review the impact that has and take the further action that will be needed in future years to reach that 23-24 target. It's a big investment, but I think as the letter that Poverty Alliance and ourselves and other members of the End Child Poverty Coalition coordinated to the First Minister and gathered signatories from many of you, I think all the panelists and many of you in the room, demonstrates that organisations that are working with families across Scotland in lots of different ways and have lots of different priorities all see investing in the Scottish Child Payment, doubling the value of that payment in the coming year as being an absolute priority. And with that support across Scotland, let's hope that our politicians have the will and the judgment and the drive to make that decision in the coming months. And in that way, we can really maintain progress towards achieving what are hugely welcome and hugely important child poverty targets. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks very much, John. That was great. I think you've set out, I think, perfectly the absolute, moral imperative that we meet the child poverty targets, not just because they're, percentage figures in a piece of legislation, but because what it will mean for lives and life chances. And I think you're also absolutely right to emphasise the fact that the targets were set to be met, with no caveats, no asterisks next to them, and with the support of the whole Scottish Parliament. And so, we must meet them. And I think you've set it perfectly, as Emma did, some of the many ways that we can do that and some of the options that we have at our disposal. And we are to the minute perfect in terms of time. So well done, John and Emma, for that. That's incredible stuff. Just before I hand over to Rachel, I would just remind you again, just to submit any questions that you have via the chat function. Don't be shy. But I will hand over to Rachel now. So Rachel Statham, Senior Research Fellow at IPPR Scotland. So IPPR Scotland are Scotland's progressive think tank, working on a huge number of policy areas, but lots of work around income. And Rachel's done lots of work around a minimum income guarantee, which she'll talk about to us now. So over to you, Rachel.
Super. Thanks very much, Neil. Can you see my slides properly? They're not small on your screen. Okay, great. Great. So I wanted to pick up from Emma and John's excellent introductions to talk about kind of one of the big new ideas that's come out of this election, or the most recent election, and something that potentially has the impact to shape progress towards targets, both in terms of interim targets and longer down the line. And that's the idea of a minimum income guarantee. And you might have heard some recent attention being paid to this in the press. This is from 3 days ago now, rather than 2 days ago when I screenshotted it. But the Scottish Government have committed in their first 100 days to establishing a working group that's exploring how we could work towards a minimum income guarantee in Scotland. At IPPR Scotland, where I work, we've been doing some thinking about how this could work in practice, how it could be a kind of guiding principle for our approach to social security in Scotland, both as more powers are devolved and then kind of longer down the line, so looking towards the next decade, but also about what action we could be taking now over this next Parliament to start to make progress or faster progress towards the interim targets and then those full targets in 2030. Similarly to Emma, this work comes through a research program that's funded by Standard Life Foundation. and we're exploring how securing incomes through the social security system, delivering a fair work recovery, and reducing costs as well through collective services, and a universal basic service approach, which the Scottish Government have also committed to, but I won't dwell on today, how that could really begin to shift the dial of living standards across Scotland. So as a primary focus, reducing poverty, but also delivering greater financial security for families who are, not in the in-poverty population, but are living on very low incomes. So looking a little bit further up the income spectrum as well. So what do we mean by minimum income guarantee? There's some confusion still, which is an important place to start. It's a kind of broad concept, but as we conceive of it, it's about providing a minimum income through the social security system, primarily through that social safety net that everyone can fall back on when their income falls below a certain level. So a fundamentally different approach to social security in terms of how payments are set, and the really important difference and distinction between current social security provision and the kind of aims and impetus of a minimum income guarantee come down to adequacy. So the generosity of payments are offered through the social safety net, and also in terms of security. So how secure that income that you can fall back on is, as opposed to how it's delivered under universal credit at the moment. So it would be a universal guarantee in that it's a system that anybody can fall back on, but it's delivered through a targeted payment, and that's where it differs to something like citizens' basic income. There's also been talked about a lot in Scotland in recent years. It's paid to anyone whose income falls below this level, rather than anyone, regardless of their financial situation. It would also be paid to people who are not in work, either because they're out of work looking for work, or because they're not able to work due to sickness or disability. It would be paid to unpaid carers as well. Sorry, as I've just mentioned, those who fall out of paid work, for whatever reason temporarily. And those who are in work, but whose earnings fall below this threshold. It will be a secure payment, which is an important distinction. So it doesn't have a cap designed in the way that universal credit does. It's not coming with sanctions or freezes or necessary weights, and it would be designed as a needs-based payment, so aimed at meeting income requirements of different households. So it's not a one-size-fits-all sum in the way that a citizen's basic income might be, but it's looking at what your childcare costs or your disability costs are as a particular, depending on the particular composition of your household. And it would be a social safety net designed on that basis. And I should emphasize at this point, this is what our recommendations for what a minimum income guarantee could look like. And as I'll get on to, we're kind of at the beginning of exploring what that might look like with Scottish Government and with a range of partners, including Poverty Alliance. It would fundamentally be aimed at reducing poverty, inequality and insecurity rather than pushing people into work. So a different approach, again, there to current provision. And at the core of minimum income guarantee is the idea of a minimum acceptable standard of living that a social safety net would provide, would support people towards, and support people towards much further than current provision. And why should we be aiming towards this? So it's an idea that's been around for quite a long time, the idea of a minimum income that's guaranteed through a social safety net. But right now, what we can see is our current system of provision means that people are falling well below minimum acceptable standard of living. And that's not we're not talking about kind of destitution levels here. We're talking about, a socially acceptable standard of living. And I'll get on to how that's measured in a minute. And we think that this should be set at a bar that enables people to participate in society and protect people against poverty. So the kind of two core concerns there. And also critically that it recognises the varied costs that different households face, rather than trying to be a blunter instrument that that's going to leave some families, and particularly lone parent families, really far behind where they need to be. So how much we'll be talking about? These figures, really importantly, exclude housing costs, childcare and council tax. But this is the kind of base levels that payments would be set at under a minimum income guarantee system that was aimed at achieving those aims. And those levels are calculated on the basis of minimum income standards, which are calculated with Loughborough University and Joseph Browntree Foundation. And they basically go out to the public and speak to people about what they think an acceptable standard of living in Britain today looks like. and that's how they come to these levels of income. So it's about a life, an income that enables you to participate fully in in life in Britain at the moment. And what we could see by taking the idea of minimum income guarantee in Scotland is that we could set levels in Scotland, a minimum income level in Scotland that the social security system could begin to be based around. How far away are we now from these standards? This shows what kind of typical households without any paid work at the moment, people that are out of work, and either with one or two adults out of work, how far they're falling short at the moment. As you can see, you see lone parent families are really falling very far behind, cash shortfalls of over £1,000. So really quite drastic shortfalls in terms of our current provision. And as Emma's presentation demonstrated, we know that work alone can't fill these gaps, and particularly for lone parent households, because this is considering childcare costs, the kind of outgoings that are associated with being in work. So basically right now we're falling very far short, so it would be a much higher bar to be setting our ambitions at. Right now, this is looking at households with some paid work. So you'll see the darker bars assume kind of less paid work, and the light blue bars assume more paid work in a household. That's roughly 20 hours work for a lone parent household, 30 hours work for a single person, and then if there's a couple household, what we've modeled here is one person with 30 hours a week, one person with 20 hours a week. So that's obviously quite a lot of work. Those are the light blue bars, and then the dark blue bars are with half those hours basically, set at minimum wage rates of pay. So you can see the only people who at the moment are reaching this standard with minimum wage work and social security provision are a couple without children, who obviously have 50 hours work between them. That's quite a lot of work. And you can see that there's people falling really far short, and particularly single parents with children. And that's getting worse as you get to more children. You see particularly that bar with single parents with 3 children, you can see where the 2-child limit comes into bite as well. And these are just the kind of cash shortfalls that we're looking at in our current provision. And this is just to make the point that current social security levels and their inadequacy in terms of not just protecting against poverty, but providing a decent standard of living are a real and serious barrier. And a minimum income guarantee will be an approach that takes that seriously and aims to start closing those gaps through social security as well as through work and collective services. And then just to touch for a second on unpaid carers, we've looked at how far they fall short at the moment, given the various social security entitlements that they might have access to, and you can see people are still falling considerably short, even if they're in a household where they're getting disability benefit and kind of carers allowance. So that would be a system that is designed to close those gaps too. So what we were talking about here is ambitions to seriously increase social security investment, to have a completely different approach to what the kind of fundamentals of our social security system are, and to meet needs across different households to a much fuller extent than the current system does, with the aim of reducing poverty and inequality and insecurity significantly. So what our modelling suggests is that delivering a full minimum income guarantee by 2030, and the really important caveat here is that a full minimum income guarantee couldn't be delivered in current powers. You'd have to have greater social security devolution. That would effectively eradicate poverty in Scotland, and obviously that assumes the take up is stronger than current levels of take up, but it would be a system that hopefully would incentivize higher levels in terms of how it's designed. But the question that we're here to talk about today is what can we do now, and what can progress, particularly between now and 23-24, look like, and what can this idea of minimum income guarantee do to help shape that thinking? And what we think is, while Scottish Government are interested in this idea, which they appear to be, they appear to be taking quite seriously as a kind of long-term ambition for what social security in Scotland might look like. There is steps that we can be taking to begin to close those gaps, and to begin to think about how we can start embedding this idea of of minimum income standard across our kind of social security plumbing in Scotland, whether that's at the local level through the kind of local payments that are set and people rely on week by week, or through the new social security agency. And some of the things we've looked at are doubling the Scottish Child Payment at the start of this parliamentary term, but also doubling it again by the end of the term. And that's what we think we need to do if we're really serious about hitting those interim targets. That would deliver 50,000, lift 50,000 children out of poverty by 2025-26. We could look at premiums attached to the attached to the Scottish Child Payment for lone parents, potentially, given the picture that we've seen around their massively disproportionate exposure to poverty in Scotland at the moment. Similarly, you could look at a higher level of payment for families with a disabled child, and then you can begin to to start making significant progress on levels of child poverty that way. And then we've also looked at how we could increase carer support to minimum income standard level as well. And then we've also looked at kind of wider elements where you can begin to try and push kind of social security powers to mitigate against some of the UK level policy decisions that are obviously increasing child poverty at the moment. So we could begin by updating and looking to reform existing benefits, looking at devolved disability payments, looking at how local payments could begin to incorporate this idea of minimum income standard, things like council tax reduction. When we get around to council tax reform as the kind of perpetual policy issue in Scotland, we could look at how a minimum income standard could begin to be the kind of central pillar of how we design council tax reduction. And then obviously Scottish Child Payment as the kind of key area to be targeting, whether we're looking at how that payment is uprated over time. We can begin to think about what work that payment can do to begin to close that gap, with the important caveat that there's only so far one payment is ever going to be able to kind of go it alone, and it'll definitely need wider action, and this is about a kind of system-wide approach to social security. And then just to finish by touching on kind of minimum income guarantee in context. So the way in which the Scottish Government have started to talk about a minimum income guarantee is not just as a kind of pure social security intervention, but as a kind of a bundle of interventions, an approach that sits across social security work and services. And that could include action to secure incomes, so to improve the generosity and the security offered by the social security system, but would also include efforts to lower barriers to getting into or getting on in work, particularly for parents given child poverty targets. And they're also very interested in the idea of the kind of social wage that collective services can provide. So looking, for instance, at how improving access to childcare can help reduce costs that are pulling parents, families and children into financial insecurity and then into poverty as well. So they see these kind of three elements as working together to provide a minimum income guarantee, kind of effective, that helps more families across Scotland achieve a living income. And then just to close, in terms of political commitments so far, where we're at in terms of interest in this idea. I think the most important point here is that there's a lot to play for. Is one thing to talk about a minimum income guarantee as a concept, but as you'll have heard, it's quite a blurry concept. There's a lot, a lot of technical detail that could kind of make or break it in terms of the impact it might have. We have had the Social Renewal Advisory Board, which advises the Scottish Government on recovery post-COVID, recommended a minimum income guarantee as an approach to social security going forward. And that was taken forward in manifesto commitments by across parties across the Parliament. And then now from this new government, we've had the establishment of a cross-party working group with MSPs from across Parliament, and with that includes an expert working group who are going to take forward what we could do to begin to embed this idea at the kind of core of social security provision in Scotland. But that group is particularly keen to work on what can be done now to begin to shift the dial on child poverty, rather than to wait to design a perfect system that's only deliverable a decade from now. And that's where I'll finish, I think. And that includes Poverty Alliance, IPPR Scotland and others. So really keen to hear your ideas about how a kind of big transformative idea can be taken forward into actual real change that can be delivered, on a nearer time frame than 2030 or beyond. And that's everything from me. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Rachel. That was fantastic. I think a brilliant overview of what a minimum income guarantee could be and how we could get there. But I think really importantly as well, setting out some of the short-term steps to actually take us towards that ultimate sort of destination. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to all three speakers for, I think, we're really excellent, stimulating contributions, which has given us loads to work from and think about. So we've got around 30-35 minutes for Q&A and discussion. And again, just as a reminder, you can either pop your question in the chat, or if you're feeling brave, you can pop your hand up and using the raising hand button on Zoom, and you can pose your questions or make your comment directly to the panel. So we've got a few questions already that have came in. So one specifically for Emma from Peter Allen. So do you have any sense yet of whether or which of these possible policies that you outlined would work at a very targeted community level, say 1,000 households? So that's a specific question for you, Emma. And then maybe the second one that we'll take, maybe for all three panelists, in terms of a minimum income guarantee, would that result, or could that result in employers exploiting the existence of such a guarantee to pay even less than wages? So could that suppress wages, and how would we prevent that, I guess, in Scotland, given that we don't have control over minimum wage? So maybe I'll come to you, Emma, first on the specific question, and also maybe on the second one as well, and then Rachel and John.
Sure. So thanks, Peter. Yeah. So first caveat, it's very difficult to model anything actually below Scotland level because of the data that's available. But that's not to say there aren't things that we can think about here. And actually, from work we've been doing some work in Northern Scotland at the moment with the Northern Alliance Regional Improvement Collaborative, thinking about some of the things that can help, so particularly in relation to educational attainment for people in poverty. But so there's some ideas, well, obviously some very obvious ones that are well talked about in terms of engagements with parents at schools, so that it's that kind of safe place for advice that parents will already be involved in and may trust. It's not always the case. So I think so it's any community-based initiatives that can pull together the right advice and be a trusted environment for parents to access help and support. And I mean, one specific, which relates to attainment, but also to kind of the challenges of poverty and rural poverty in particular, is improving access to extracurricular activities for children. So being able to kind of get people to and from, after school hours. So, I mean, after school clubs are part of this, but actually transport can be quite difficult and put constraints on parents being able to work because they need to ferry their children around. So quite small things like that, community level. Then also from the work we've done on learning disabilities, that kind of access to potentially it sometimes is volunteering and sometimes can be paid employment opportunities for those who are kind of more excluded from mainstream labour market. Within a community setting, that there might be opportunities for people to get more involved in those things amongst trusted kind of local people that they know. So some work that the Development Trust Association for Scotland have done, looking at what kind of availability and what options there are to really engage people with, particularly with learning disabilities, but a wider range of disabilities into local employment through sort of community trusts. So I don't know if that's published yet, but I'll try and track down the link and send it on to you. So that's just a couple of things for insights, and John and Rachel may have something to add. But just quickly on the kind of knock-on effects of some of the things like the minimum income guarantee. I think there isn't a straightforward answer to this because it's the economy and so many factors relate. So if anyone tells you there's an answer to this, they're lying, because it depends on so many factors. So potentially, yes, you've got employers who would be looking at the lowest pay that they can get away with in order to bring people into the workplace. And I think there is some evidence from the tax credit years that might have dampened wage growth among low pay, but that also happened amongst a period of kind of immigration, so kind of a big pool of labour available. So so that those kind of wider structural factors are really important. And I suppose with a minimum income guarantee, it may also shift some of the balance in terms of kind of choice back the other way. So it may actually be that parts of the labour force may be like, well, actually, I'm not going to go out and work for that wage. I can survive. I'm going to take some time and look around, maybe retrain, look for some other ideas. And that could reduce the supply in the labour market, which would then have the impact, all else being held equal, of increasing wages. So there's so many factors at play. I think as economists, we can maybe model ranges to help understand the scale of some of these impacts, but the exact direction and scale is just impossible to kind of predict with something that's such a big change like this.
Thanks, Emma. So maybe come to you first, John, on the potential knock-on impacts of a minimum income guarantee, and particularly knock-on impacts on wages. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it was just to, I suppose it just highlights the importance of, I think, one of Rachel's slides. We need policies working, complementing each other to ensure people's incomes meet standards that allow for a socially acceptable standard of living. So alongside action to improve adequacy and security within the social security system, we clearly need to see policy to improve security and rewards in the labour market, and be using the levers that we have now in Scotland, but also lobbying for the use of levers at a UK level to ensure that employers are paying decent wages, are providing adequate security as part of that. So I suppose for me, it just highlights the importance of looking at both of these things in tandem as part of that. And I'll maybe leave Emma and Rachel in terms of how these things interact. And as I think Emma's already highlighted, it's very hard to understand or to know exactly how they will interact. But I don't think, I suppose my key thing would be that we shouldn't be using, we want to avoid kind of unnecessary, without any evidence to suggest that this would actually drive down incomes overall, using this as an excuse not to drive up improvements in the adequacy and the security of our social security system through ideas like the minimum income guarantee, or through just improving adequacy of existing social security support.
Thanks, John. And Rachel?
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of what's been said. I think it's definitely a complicated question, and it's something that hopefully through through future IPPR Scotland work and also through this expert group that's working with Scottish Government to kind of work through some of these questions around how minimum income guarantee could operate in practice, we can do with the caveats that Emma's already offered, our kind of best efforts to work out what this could look like. But I think it's important that that's not a kind of total barrier to the ambition, of a new approach to social security, and to tackling that question of adequacy, given what we know about the limits of how far work can go alone. We're going to need these kind of three elements of social security, work and services to be working in tandem if we're going to make serious and lasting progress on child poverty, on adult poverty as well. I think it's very important that we have an informed view of what the wider economic impacts across the labour markets might look like, but we don't anticipate that would be an insurmountable barrier to action. I think it's important that we just keep a view across the piece when we're having these conversations, and connect them up, so that we don't have interventions that work on one side and then don't work in terms of work incentives.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Couple more questions there. So one from Laura Robertson. So Laura's asking about new disability payments in Scotland and what the key barriers might be to raising the level of payments slightly higher than PIP. So I guess financial barriers, public support barriers, and maybe actually more broadly than that, if I can add just adequacy overall. What are the key barriers to ensuring adequacy and embedding adequacy within the social security system in Scotland? So yeah, any thoughts on that would be great. And then also, second question from Kirsty McNeil, who asks, how do we ensure that targets are met without leaving behind priority families, particularly for minority and ethnic families where the numbers are relatively small, but poverty rates are high? So yeah, those two questions. I'll maybe come to John first on those.
Thanks, Neil. So I suppose on new disability payments, I suppose firstly I think it's important that we recognise that those are payments to support disabled people with the additional costs of disability. They're not income replacement or payments. So we need to look at those. What are those additional costs of disability, and are the payments adequate to meet those additional costs? And make sure that we're looking at that alongside income replacement or income-based means tested benefits as well. What are the barriers? I think it's about building up public support, awareness, understanding of what these benefits are for, and what where the current inadequacy lies, and making the case for the kinds of improvements that are needed. But perhaps maybe worth looking at building the evidence base of where that gap is between the value of those payments and the actual additional costs of disability and the barriers that disabled people face. And clearly those payments, as we've kind of flagged, children and families affected by disability, particularly at risk of poverty. So ensuring both that those families have adequate disability benefits, and also that those benefits enable them to overcome the barriers to employment, overcome the barriers that prevent them from developing their incomes more generally, absolutely critical as part of wider action to tackle child poverty and meet the poverty targets. And yeah, absolutely, minority ethnic families, children growing up in the minority ethnic families at particular risk of poverty. I think I highlighted that briefly. And yes, even though they may not make up the big percentage or proportion of overall families, absolutely critical that the policies that we develop reach those children and those families. And maybe that is about some of the things I talked about in terms of how we look at, for example, ensuring take-up of benefits. Are we ensuring that the new Scottish Child Payment is reaching all families, all children, including those from minority ethnic families? Are there, for some of those families, immigration status issues that mean that they're not receiving that payment? And how do we use other mechanisms that we have at local government level, for example, to get equivalent financial support to some of those families? So it's about, I suppose, just ensuring that we're proofing the overall child poverty policies for their particular impact on children growing up in minority ethnic families, and ensuring that they are getting the benefit of that impact.
Thanks, John. We'll maybe come to Rachel next.
Yeah, I think it's a good question on disability payments. I think, as John's mentioned, the challenge there is that there isn't a kind of standard measure of obviously what additional costs associated with disability might be. That varies, really significantly across, any individual, let alone households. And so I think it's about kind of embedding the kind of principles around, particularly around security, even if adequacy is a bit more complicated question in the context of disability. Building security around those new benefits that are devolved. And then thinking through the interactions between different elements of our social security system when we're thinking about what a minimum income guarantee looks like in practice, and particularly how those kind of core payments that people are, a range of people in a range of circumstances are going to rely on, whether that's people who are not able to work long term, or people who are out of work temporarily, unemployed, or people who are on low income in work. Thinking about how you can design a system that works across the wide range of circumstances in which people rely on the social safety net. That's where that's the work that really matters, and the kind of complicated questions that we need to be thinking about as we look to design a devolved social security system, and then to have potentially more of those elements devolved to the agency in Scotland. And then I think an important part of that equation, just again thinking across the piece, is pathways into work for disabled people who want to go into work, or particularly as we've been hearing through some of our recent research on a kind of fair work recovery, people with fluctuating conditions who might be kind of in and out of the labour market, and how you can begin to provide greater income security for people in that situation who might have variable incomes from the labour market, and who right now have to go through kind of cyclical fight to get back on the social security support that they need when they're not able to work. So just wanted to raise that too.
Great, thanks Rachel. And Emma?
Yeah, just a little bit to add on the disability question. I think what John said about the fact that it's an addition, the disability payments that are devolved are additional costs, benefits rather than income replacement. And so we need to potentially think about where in the short term and the long term, where the devolved powers on income replacement benefits are. So we're talking about things like the universal credit and any top-ups that the government could introduce there. And Scottish Child Payment is another route, which itself is a top-up benefit, but you could then add a premium into it for to link to disability. So I think potentially in terms of tackling poverty as an income issue, that might be more of the route you would look down. Although in terms of figuring out the impacts, big caveat, actually the data we have is exceptionally poor on take up or like who's getting disability benefits. Hopefully that will improve with it transferring over to Scotland. But at the moment, the records which show who's in poverty, who's getting means tested support, and who's getting additional cost support, that it's really poor. So that needs to be improved in order to be able to actually do some effective kind of analysis and understanding of what support is required. And then I guess, well, linking back, I guess, to the disability support payments that are devolved, there are questions there in terms of the interaction with the UK benefit system and some of how some of this falls into the terms of the fiscal framework. And it's very complicated, and some of you may have come across people talking about spillover effects and issues that just cast lots of uncertainty over the extent to which Scotland can change its devolved benefits on disability and carers and not face kind of financial repercussions because of the impact that has on the reserved social security system. And as I say, it's just a massive grey area at the moment as to what would happen, and I think that's one key area we really need to kind of work to resolve, because I think it potentially puts a bit of block on actual being able to do effective policy and plan effective policy and know what's going to happen and when you've got these big question marks over the fiscal framework hanging in the air. So yeah, I think that's one thing to bear in mind, but it shouldn't mean that we should do nothing in terms of these devolved benefits, but it's something we need to understand better as to the implications it has.
Great, thank you, Emma. Yeah, the fiscal framework's a big topic to tackle on a Friday morning. We've got an additional question from Vicky Chapman as a kind of follow-up to the question around minority ethnic families. So Vicky's saying Scottish Government policies aren't always written in plain English, so imagine how difficult this is for someone who has English as a second language, I guess, with particular respect to things like accessing your social security entitlements. So is there something around making information more accessible to minority ethnic families as well, I guess, as a means to improve awareness of entitlements and boosting incomes that way? So your thoughts on that would be welcome. And again, I guess relatedly, if I can kind of abuse my privilege as chair, so I wanted to ask a question on something that I think a couple of you have touched on in terms of take up. So, we know that as impactful as Scottish Child Payment and other Scottish benefits can be, their impact is clearly going to be less if take up isn't where we want or need it to be. So I suppose what more can we do to boost take up kind of across the board? So yeah, two kind of related questions, but it'd be good to get your thoughts on that. I guess, yeah, both centered around how do we make sure that everyone that has got entitlements can actually access those social security entitlements. I'll maybe come to Rachel first.
Sure, yeah. Take up's obviously always, a really critical part of this conversation. I think there's a huge amount that can be done. There's hopefully progress that's being, that will begin to be made through the take up strategy. I think, how benefits are offered, how easy or straightforward those systems are to navigate, whether or not you can actually access, the application system, if, for instance, you're doing it with the help of a translator, whether that becomes practically impossible for you. These are really important questions that can only really be resolved by working with people who are, current claimants of the system about, what their experience is like, and to identify particular barriers. And particularly where those barriers might not affect, huge numbers of people, but they are insurmountable barriers, to those that are trying to make a claim, and who be eligible for a payment. And I think another important aspect where we've begun to see some progress made is automating entitlements, so particularly at the local level, where if you're qualifying for council tax reduction, there's an automatic kind of check across what else you might be eligible for that you might not know that you're eligible for, and that those sorts of fixes that can be supported by tech innovation within local authorities or within the Social Security Agency, although big questions there about data streams and negotiations with HMRC and DWP. Those are the kind of design priorities that can begin to make a really big difference to people actually just getting the the income that they're entitled, that they're eligible for, the support that they're eligible for. So that will be my kind of big priority in that space.
Thanks, Rachel. We'll come to Emma next for any thoughts on the issue of take up.
Yeah, so it kind of relates to both points about communication and actually the importance of inclusive communications. This is something that Social Security Scotland just have grabbed hold of, but and others sort of will need to catch up a bit, specifically I think DWP, but ensuring that information is provided in a way that's accessible to everyone, regardless of their language abilities, or kind of other impairments, visual impairments, hearing impairments. So I think that's something that's really key, particularly given we know how many people with a disability are in poverty. So I definitely think that's something that could be done more of. And I think Rich has covered quite a lot of really important things on take up. Again, actually, the fiscal framework rears its head here, and people are unsure whether or not Scottish government can promote UK government benefits, and it's just ridiculous that that's an issue, but it is apparently. So even though it's resolved in relation to the Scottish Child Payment, where the Scottish Government is definitely allowed to promote Scottish Child Payment and take up of the benefits that passport people onto it, but still unsure on some of the other questions. So resolve that quickly.
Thanks, Emma. And then John, views on take up and how we can make sure that everyone can access or is accessing what they're entitled to.
So obviously there is more, it can always be done to improve communication and information about benefit entitlements, ensuring that that's communicated in ways that whether it's people with English as a second language or other communication barriers are aware of the financial support they're entitled to. I think it's about building on the culture that does seem to be developing here in Scotland, creating the idea that these are benefits and supports that people are entitled to, that are an investment that the government wants you to take up, rather than being seen as too often at UK level as being seen as a kind of trying to create barriers to take up. I think it's also about going back a stage and making sure, what's the process for delivery of the benefit, and what processes are we putting in place when we're creating new sources of financial support or developing sources of financial support, that we're creating a process and a system that's as straightforward and as accessible as possible. And then maybe a sort of final point, I think we can learn from which are the benefits that have the highest levels of take up. So for example, child benefit, 98% take up, I think, levels, a really important part of the overall mix of financial support that helps to prevent child poverty. It's a benefit that has seen its value eroded by, I think, nearly 30% over the last 10 years. That has been a significant contributing factor to the increasing levels of child poverty we've seen. And I think here in Scotland, as we start to raise the bar and think imaginatively about what would we do if there were other social security powers available to us, that we don't lose sight of the value of universal benefits as part of the overall mix, as a way of getting very straightforwardly secure, stable source of income to families. So that we don't lose sight of the value of that part of our benefit system, and start to rebuild some of that.
Thank you, John. We've got a question from Mandy Sheridan around taxes and tax, and how we'll pay for some of the kind of increased investment that we've been speaking about. So obviously, we all know the Scottish Government's in a difficult financial position, but Mandy's asking around increasing business taxes and taxes on the rich and the wealthy to fund some of this investment. What is your take on whether or not that's something that needs to happen? If it is, how can we make it happen? What are the kind of taxation powers that we should be kind of flexing? Maybe come to the economists first on this one. So I'll come to Emma first on this.
Yeah, tax. Favorite topic. So I think well, the minimum income guarantee, which I'm sure Rich could talk about in much more detail, obviously had a price tag attached to it. Any increase in social security will tend to have a price tag associated with it, but that might just be a short-term cost. I think, as John mentioned, over the longer term, there's potential for preventative spend in order to really change the kind of financial profile of support over people's lives. So, but yeah, I think we do need to talk about tax. I think it's difficult to imagine big reforms on tax in the next few years. Not impossible, but so but over the past, say, I don't know, 5-6 years, we've had a reform to income tax. Doesn't seem to be much appetite for another one. We've had 2 reviews, one into council tax and one into business rates, and neither of those reviews came up with some ideas. Neither of those reviews were translated into full-scale reform of the system, particularly in council tax, that was advocated for. So it does leave us in a difficult position because, where is this money going to come from? So some of the modelling we've done looked at, what kinds of increases in some of the income tax bands would be required, and depending on the level of change, we're probably not talking about significant increases in tax, but just 1 or 2 pence per band, or slightly more on the higher levels. But it's politically, I think we have to appreciate the difficulties in that, and not necessarily expect too much, unfortunately. But then it's other than thinking about where else spend could be reduced, and there is scope for that even within some of the tax systems in terms of business rate reliefs, for example, that maybe aren't that effective, or so there are options there. But it's a very good question, and I think it's very important that it's part of the debate. And I think we then also need to realise or start to try and understand the implications of changes to the tax system, because it's all interconnected, in terms of the economy, and actually in terms of people on relatively low incomes that may face tax increases, and how do you look at that all in the round. Again, it is very complicated, and models can only take us so far. but there's a lot to consider. But you can't talk about social security reform without talking about tax reform. I totally agree with that, and I think that's probably where skepticism starts to come in terms of some of the words that we hear around, big new policies. Implement them, I think, is something that, and so far we've not seen, that kind of putting those words into actions as much as we probably need to see in order to get anywhere near reaching the child poverty targets.
Great, thanks, Emma. I'll maybe come to Rachel next. So yeah, Rachel, how can we sort of flex or utilise our tax powers to the best extent? And I guess I know that IPPR have obviously done a lot of work in recent years on, or did do some work on around local taxation powers as well. Maybe you can touch upon that as well and how they could be used to a kind of a fuller extent. Rachel. Yeah,
definitely. So, as Emma touched on, income tax is obviously the big tax lever in Scotland, and we think there is, some. There's quite significant progress that you could make, particularly on, getting towards the child poverty targets without, politically outrageous or infeasible income tax increases. Although I would very much echo Emma's points around having to look at those decisions in the round, particularly looking at, questions around behavioural effects. We have there's limits to how far Scotland's income tax system could radically diverge from that across the UK. And then I think what we've been looking at the local level, particularly recently, we've tried to resurface some new ideas around council tax reform, or newer ideas around council tax reform, as the kind of perpetual topic. I think I don't need to rehearse the need for council tax reform in Scotland, but the fact that we haven't had political commitments this time around, this election. This election round, it doesn't seem to be on the table as a live issue. Maybe with the announcement of Greens today, they'll manage to push a little bit on council tax reform, but that's where you could start. A much more kind of progressive approach to council tax could start to raise more money for local authorities. That you could see, you could work out how that could support social security reform that saw more money going out the door to low income families, and also to lower the council tax liabilities that lower income households are currently bearing. And then I think there's also questions around things like property taxes, inheritance taxes that could be administered at the local level. Those kind of bigger taxation questions are being discussed across the UK, some of which are potentially within devolved powers if you instigate them as local taxes. I think in Scotland, we tend to forget that you can effectively design whatever kind of local authority level tax you want within the kind of limits of feasibility, and whether or not you can actually collect that tax. But there is some space for kind of creativity there, even if options are more limited in terms of what can be done at the national level.
Thanks, Rachel. And finally, John.
Just agree with the others that we do need to talk about tax. I'd maybe plug a CPAG publication that we produced a couple of years ago called Let's Talk About Tax. So there's some interesting ideas in there looking at a UK level, but including a chapter by Emma's colleague David Iser looking at devolved tax here in Scotland. So it is something we need to look at through a child poverty lens. The bottom line is, Scotland is a country with extraordinary wealth and income. The levels of child poverty we have are not a product of not having enough resources. They're a product of the way as a society we decide to distribute those resources. And clearly tax as well as spending needs to be part of what we think about if we're going to achieve the 2030 targets. I agree with the others. I think in the short term, the reality is interim targets are 2-3 years away. Those can be met within existing resources and prioritising existing resources. But 2030, it's harder to see how that would happen without a more fundamental rethink about how we use tax powers here in Scotland to redistribute resources. So yeah, it's not just about business taxes. And I think, as Rachel's already flagged, it's not just about business taxes, not just about taxes on the rich. I think it's about how we all think about what we contribute and how we distribute resources, not just between rich and poor, but across the life course as well. At different points in our life, we're able to put more into the system and then take it out at other times as well. So yes, really important, something we need to not lose sight of. We've kind of, along with others, have been doing some thinking, bringing together people thinking about taxation here in Scotland from a particular child poverty perspective, and continue to do that.
Thanks very much, John. And I like that you had that prop handy as well. That was absolutely, that was seamless. That was great. I think we've only a couple of minutes left. Just probably time for one more question. Claire Simpson has asked about childcare. We're actually got a webinar next Friday, which will be looking at services. So we'll cover childcare then. So kind of hold fire on that one. And maybe just to end on a sort of a positive note, I suppose. I guess my question would be, maybe you can answer this as shortly as you wish. Get a programme for government in a couple of weeks. If there's one action that you think needs to be included in that programme for government to boost incomes, I think I probably know the answer to this from, but what would it be? What is the one action that we can include in programme for government to help us get towards the targets and get us where we need to be? I'll maybe come to Rachel first. And you feel free to be as brief as you like, so we'll have a couple of minutes left.
I feel this might be echoed by others, but doubling the Scottish Child Payment would be a very good place to start.
Great. And Emma?
So yeah, I'll go a bit different. So I think actually from the work I've done so far, it would actually be a commitment towards looking at childcare for younger children. I think that's such a big gap, and maybe I'll be able to tune in next Friday if there's space for your webinar to hear a bit more about some of that.
Thanks, Emma. And finally, John?
Yeah, as important as childcare is, and improving childcare in terms of having the impact needed for 23-24, then doubling the Scottish Child Payment as a matter of utmost urgency and seeing that in the coming budget.
Great. Thanks very much. Maybe we can have both in the programme for government. Let's see.
Yeah, I'd say double the Scottish Child Payment as well.
Great, perfect. Okay, decided. So yeah, we are now, I'm afraid, just about out of time. So thank you all very, very much. That was really, really valuable and helpful and useful discussion, really stimulating discussion. And yeah, lots of ideas. And I think it's quite clear that we can meet the targets. It just requires prioritisation and yes, investment, but prioritisation is the key thing. So as I mentioned, we have our third and final webinar of this short series next Friday at the same time of 10 AM, which will look at the services that we need to prevent reduced poverty in Scotland. So speakers will include Satvat Raymond from the Director of One Parent Family Scotland and Martin Dorchester, who's Chief Exec of Include. I'm afraid to say it is already fully booked, so if you haven't already got your place, then I'm sorry. But if you have, then we look forward to seeing you next week. I should also say, given that this is a Get Here Scotland event, that earlier this week we launched the summary report from our Get Here Scotland engagement from April 2020 to April 2021. And you can see that report on our website, so please do have a look and check it out. Just finally, say thank you again to our three brilliant speakers, to Emma, John and to Rachel. Thanks to everyone for coming along and attending, for your questions, your contributions. And yeah, have a lovely weekend when it comes. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much.